Alright, welcome to another Muscle Academy video. You might be thinking, what the hell am I looking at? A bunch of dudes in their underwear, standing in a line. This is actually some of my friends, and we were practicing posing, and then they were just kind of messing around. So, lol. I'm going to do a bit of a talk about tapering today, because I went through deloading last week, and since I'm now in my tapering phase, I thought that it would be appropriate to kind of have a chat about that and discuss that. So, a taper is defined as a short-term reduction in training load during a period leading up to a competitive event. That we could consider a formal definition of tapering. Tapering is actually used across a variety of sports. So a sprinter would taper before a sprinting race. Powerlifters taper before meets. Swimmers taper. Endurance athletes taper. So it can involve a reduction. When we're talking about tapering for sports, it can be a reduction of volume, intensity, frequency, or a combination of those things. But when we're talking about tapering for bodybuilding and lifting in general, I think that it's good to separate out deloading and tapering, because we can look at those two things separately. So like I said last week, with deloading, it's typically a reduction in intensity, whereas tapering we can look at as a reduction in volume whilst intensity is kept high. So having said that, right now I'm tapering, and I want to go through how I structure my tapers at the moment. And that is that I will typically deload for a week, and then I will usually taper for 1 to 2 weeks. At times I've tapered for longer. In fact, I've tapered for up to 8 weeks at a time. But typically it's about 2 weeks. And I will usually see, strength and performance increases more or less immediately during the taper. So what I usually do with volume is I cut it down by 50%. So if I'm doing 4 sets per exercise, I will just cut that in half, and I'll do 2 sets per exercise. If I'm doing an odd number of sets, usually for a particular exercise, like 3 sets or 5 sets, I'll usually just divide it by 2 and then round the number up. So if I was doing 5 sets for a particular exercise, I end up doing 3 sets during the taper. I find that's just an easier way to do it, rather than trying to worry about getting exactly 50%. Even if it's 2/3 of my normal volume, I'm still tapering, and it still works well. So a structure that I would recommend in general is keeping intensity high, trying to increase performance whilst reducing volume. And that volume reduction can vary. It could be anywhere up to maybe even 70% of your reduction of that much. So just doing 30% of your normal volume. But I like to keep it around 50%. So just cutting volume in half is a really good rule to use. And as I said, make performance increases where able to. Keeping form, keeping good form. Don't push it to the point where you're losing form. Again, like I said before, in terms of length of time that you want to taper, I think usually 1 to 2 weeks, especially if you've done a deload first. 1 or 2 weeks is usually pretty good. It's going to depend on the context, but that's usually a sufficient period of time to really see some good performance increases. And yeah, I mean, as I said, there's been times where I continued that on for up to even 8 weeks, and it kind of just became an intensity block where performance was just more or less continuously going up. And yeah, we just happen to keep volume down and that for that period of time, which I think is a good way to do things every now and then. You probably don't want to train with as a bodybuilder with low volume all the time, but here and there to do a block of focusing on really, being strong is not a bad thing. Uh, in terms of tapers and deloads, you don't necessarily have to do both. Both are recovery strategies with a little bit different focuses, obviously. A deload is really good for general recovery, um, nervous system recovery, and also like your joints, that type of thing. It gives them a rest from heavy lifting. Whereas a taper is a little bit more performance based, and that's usually what it is used for with sports and powerlifting and stuff to increase performance. But it still gives you some level of recovery because you're cutting down on the volume. It probably doesn't give your joints as much of a rest as a deload would because you're still lifting with a lot of intensity, and it's only that you're cutting down on the amount of volume that you're doing. So you've got to think, why would I include a taper as a bodybuilder? A good reason is that every now and then you probably want to test maxes. If you're running any type of good programming, you're probably doing some type of maxing every now and then to track your progress or to use those numbers in a spreadsheet for percentages or something like that. If you are doing max testing every now and then, tapering beforehand makes sense, right? Because you want to have good performance when you're testing those maxes. That's something that I do, and that's why I taper as well as to see those performance increases in general. Um, Even if you aren't doing that, I think it still makes sense to do that just for the recovery benefits and for the performance benefits. Seeing those can be a good thing, and like I said, sometimes you might even do blocks of training where you focus on volume or intensity more, and a taper is kind of the same thing for a short period of time. Don't worry about losing muscle whilst you're tapering. I don't think you're going to lose muscle in that short period of time, especially if you are keeping intensity up. The only problem might be if you were to take volume too low and do it for too long. But a couple of weeks training with high intensity, you're probably not going to lose anything. If anything, you're going to gain. Your performance is going to be up, which is a positive thing. How would you transition back into normal training is a good thing to consider. Because I think you don't necessarily want to jump straight back into high volume training, having come off a taper. You probably want to have like an introduction week to your next block where you increase volume a little bit from where you were tapering, and that way you're going to maintain a little bit more of the performance and strength increases that you experienced during the taper, rather than just blowing them all away by, doubling or tripling your volume straight off the bat. So I would definitely recommend that type of introduction week back into your next block of training. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about is what kind of performance increases can you expect. I think that's going to depend on a variety of factors, and that those things might be how much fatigue you experienced during your training block, the effectiveness of how you structure your deload and taper, whether you deload and taper together or whether you just taper alone. And usually they're not massive. Usually they're small to moderate increases. I typically on my secondary work will experience a couple of extra reps. I might be able to increase the weight on some of the secondary exercises, especially compound exercises, and for my main lifts I'm usually able to do the same, increase the weight a little bit, and I can usually continue to do that throughout the length of the taper, depending how long the taper is. So yeah, just be realistic, guys. Especially if you're an advanced lifter, don't be expecting huge increases. So that should be about it for this episode. Remember to like and subscribe if you liked this video, and I'll be seeing you guys in the next episode. Thanks for watching.